Bruce DuMont back for hour number 2 of Beyond the Beltway. Thank you very much for joining us. Our phone lines remain open at 1-800-723-8289. In the studio, we are joined by Patrick Hanley. He is a consultant and a Democrat persuasion, and also Nick Kaczarubis, who is a professor at DePaul University and has been around this guest chairs for many, many years. If you listened to the program a couple of weeks ago, you heard Major General Jeffrey Schlosser, who is author of a new book called Marathon War, Leadership in Combat in Afghanistan. He was a terrific guest. He joined us for an hour. We got lots of response. And given what is happening in Afghanistan just in the last couple of weeks since the general was on the program, we have invited him back to join us. So, General, welcome back to Beyond the Beltway.
Hey, Bruce, thanks for having me back on.
I'd like to begin by getting your update assessment of what you've seen with your own eyes, at least via television, over the last couple of weeks. It seems to me that the situation that you were projecting might be more dire than you expected.
Yeah, so Bruce, I mean, obviously, we talked about it 2 weeks ago, and I warned that it was going to be pretty traumatic and fairly horrific over a period of time. I was thinking months up to a year or so. What we're seeing right now is the collapse of the Afghan army in certain locations. And, we've, at this point now, 2 weeks ago, none of the provincial capitals, there's 34 provinces. Think of them as states inside of Canada, or just like in the United States. And then they're made up of districts like counties. And so out of the 34, none had fallen 2 weeks ago. And the latest count that we have as of just about an hour ago is 4 or maybe 5 have fallen. And many of them are in locations, or several of them are in locations that we really didn't think. I would not have guessed that it would have been up in the northern area, which is the area of the Northern Alliance, which tends to be anti-Taliban and anti-Pushtun. And so what you're seeing there is that city centers crumbling, fighting occurring in the city centers as well as in the government. And you're also seeing a fairly, and I said this before that it would happen, an assassination program that is fairly robust. They're trying to kill. They tried to kill the defense minister this last week and failed. But they have been killing journalists in a really horrific way, and we won't get into that, as well as others who are been on their target list, such as city government, provincial government, media for sure is on their target screen as well. So all in all, it's pretty grim change from 2 weeks ago.
When we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you urged everyone to let their members of Congress know how important it was to find a place for those interpreters from Afghanistan who helped American troops, to find a place for them to stay and come to the United States. That has picked up considerably, but to what extent does that need even more speed given what's happened in the last couple of weeks, and those people and their families are now all living in fear?
Yeah, so exactly. It's a very appropriate question, Bruce. So, and again, this applies not only to the interpreters that served American forces, but also all NATO forces, including Canada, obviously, as well as in Germany and Italy. What's happened is that any way to get to Kabul, which is where the paperwork has to be accomplished, at least for the Americans, and then to fly out of Kabul International Airport, which is the only real standing international airport really left, is really challenging now. I mean, just imagine you have your family in tow, you've got some paperwork that proves that you work for American forces or Canadian forces or you name it, right? And you're carrying that with you because you need that as proof. And you get stopped because the roads in many cases are being controlled by the Taliban now, and they have checkpoints. And they come out, they search your car, they search your bags, and what do they find? And then all of a sudden you're about dead. So the challenge is really to get to Kabul in the first place. And the American numbers are very high. I mean, I've seen the U.S. report of it, from the U.S. Department of State was 35,000 Just think about that. We've probably got out about 4, maybe 600 or so far, at least from the U.S. side. And I do know that the Canadians had at least one flight as well that landed in Toronto just a few days ago.
Do you
But it's,
believe
again,
that
the challenge is going to be immense.
are we at this moment, are we as a government, are we acting as quickly as we can on each of these cases, or is there just a universal delay which is brought on by bureaucracies?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer to your question is absolutely not. We are not acting as fast as we should. Now, shame on us. We should have gotten, as soon as we began negotiations, a year ago, we should have started to do exactly what we're trying to do now, which is to get out the translators, the interpreters, the people that worked on U.S. funded, I know NGOs, non-governmental organizations that have links to the United States. They are all part of this mix, although the latter has a different requirement for their paperwork and the bureaucratic machinations. You put your finger right on the problem. It's a huge bureaucratic issue. And at the same time, the U.S. Embassy in Kabul is under a great deal of stress. There's a lot of people there, but I just saw a warning yesterday from the embassy urging all American citizens to immediately leave Afghanistan. It would not surprise me if you don't see very soon a ordered departure, basically, of some number of U.S. workers in that embassy. It's going to make it even harder to accomplish what we set out to do. That, along with just the sheer numbers, as well as just trying to get to Kabul, as we just talked about, I think it's a fairly grim situation right now. A lot of people are going to have a real problem, and you're probably going to see many of them just slip over the border, which is going to, of course, make the situation pretty tense in some of these neighboring countries.
Now, you said a couple of weeks ago that the number of Americans actually there would be about 600, I believe, to protect the embassy, and the rest would all be gone. My question to you now, given the speed with which the Taliban seems to want to rub our nose into it and not give us any peace of mind even for a couple of months during their involvement, is there a scenario where a larger contingent of Americans would be sent there to just keep the Kabul airport open? And
I think there's always a scenario that's. Go ahead, Bruce.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I missed your second one. Yeah, I think there's always a scenario that's possible like that. I mean, again, administrations can change their way when reality meets their desires or their intent, right? I mean, that's what happened in the Obama administration in Iraq when the Islamic State decided to take over the northern part of that country, as well as all of that portion of Syria that links to Iraq. And so the U.S. drew forces back in, a significant number of forces. I don't sense that the administration is doing or it wants to do that, clearly. And I'm not sure that they really plan on doing that. I think you are seeing the extended use of air support. But again, we've talked about this before, that flying air support now from either the UAE or Qatar or off of aircraft carriers is hours away, literally. And so the amount of missions that can be accomplished to support the Afghans is going to be limited. The truth is that all the people that helped call in that air support are also gone. They're gone.
We've got to pause. We're talking with Major General Jeffrey Schlosser. We'll be back shortly from Chicago. DuMont back. We continue. Patrick Hanley is here. He is a Democrat. He's also a consultant. And General, he has read your book, and he has a couple of questions for you. Patrick, go ahead.
General, first I just want to say it's an honor to be on the show with you, and thank you so much for your long years of service. I've been reading your book with great interest, Marathon War, and I just so appreciate the vivid detail and the stories that you bring to the headlines. I've been reading about the events that you participated in, but just hearing your perspective on it has been really interesting. You talk a lot about courage, competence, and character, and you speak about how the first two can be trained into a force, but the third is more elusive. And it just makes me wonder, from your perspective, how do you train character? Yeah,
Patrick, that is really a hard question. I think that over time, I really don't believe that, as I say in the book, any of those attributes that make up good leadership, we're not born with them. I wasn't born with character, or think of somebody that you really respect, and whoever it might be, and they weren't born, I don't think, that way. They develop it over a period of time. Parents play a big role, I think, and so do mentors and other people of that nature. But you really go through school of hard knocks. It's what you experience and how you deal with what you experience, trying to pull out a positive light, but at the same time, always insisting that what you do has a certain amount of, one, you're truthful to yourself, but then you're truthful to everybody else. You have integrity, in other words. People can actually trust what you say, and then eventually trust that you're going to speak the right, well, you're going to speak up for what is right. Those, I think, are really cornerstones for doing that. I got to tell you, this is, developing character in yourself. I've tried hard over, my lifetime, and it's a lot of hard work. Some amount of discipline, I got to tell you that. And over a period of time, I have tried really, really hard to be the person that, one, my children and my grandchildren would look up to and regard as a mentor and a role model. And in many cases, that kind of bleeds over. What you do for your family bleeds over into the organizations you lead. Well, really a tough question, though.
But General, I got to say, character shines throughout your book. So thank you for that.
Nick Kaczarubis from DePaul University has a question for you, General.
Thank you, General. And it sounds like you were talking a little bit about authentic leadership, which is something I teach in my classes. But I being someone who works in the public administration realm, my question to you is President Biden and even there's been a debate about pulling out of Afghanistan for a long time. My question is, how should we have done it?
One, Nick, I need to look up your class because I'm always interested in leadership. So thanks for mentioning that. I'll look that up because I'm a big believer in authenticity. I actually, used to brief President George Bush, and then got to take then Senator Obama all around Afghanistan for about a full day. And it gave him some advice as well, because that was my job at that point in time. Both of those presidents wanted to find a way to stop what they already thought was a forever war, and then it was not even quite a decade. Clearly, you could see that President Trump wanted to do exactly the same thing, and then put in the negotiations, which I think many of us believe would be needed. I mean, the Taliban were not going to completely give up, and they couldn't win, but they were not going to lose. The problem is when you negotiate, you have to have some kind of basis for the other side to actually believe that you're going to do what you say, which is, in other words, I'm going to uphold certain things unless you also do them. And we didn't do that. And what we did here over the last several months is we set a date certain to depart. And then we also said we are leaving. We're not going to leave any soldiers or anybody else to help maintain the Afghan army, and not even help their Afghan Air Corps, not being able to help maintain that. The contractors are leaving. All of our NATO allies, they had to leave because we pulled out the logistics. I think if we left a handful, just like 2,500 to 3,000 advisors, that's what we've had. We've not had a combat casualty, at least American forces, in over a year in Afghanistan. And if we continue their support and continue to do contractor support and on their Air Corps, which the plan still goes another 2 years. It was our plan, but now we are leaving. I think that would have been enough. And Nick, as you well know, as we look around the world, we still have forces in a lot of countries, Japan, South Korea, Germany, Kuwait, all places where we have a national interest.
Right. And when you were here a couple of weeks ago, I asked that question because this was a lack of candor in selling the war early on, is that when America goes to war, Americans are going to be there 50 or 60 years later. and it was soft pedaled maybe in the wake of the attack on 9/11. Maybe presidents didn't think they need to jack up the troops or the the public about it. But I think that was oversold. I've been talking about that for a decade on this show. That's a big mistake. Now, as the United States is going through this horrible withdrawal period, what is China doing, General?
Well, let's remind all of our listeners, all of our American listeners, that because some of us aren't so good on maps, right? That China actually butts up to Afghanistan. It's not a huge border, but China butts up against it. And they've long wanted to, like they do elsewhere in the world, they wanted access to mineral resources. And so they've actually, in agreement, owned one of the world's largest copper mines there in Afghanistan already. And they are trying to build a railroad track through China into Afghanistan to be able to take those mineral resources out. There's no doubt that they want to take advantage of our departure. That said, they've got issues with Islamic radicalism as well, especially on their western border.
Okay.
And so they're going to want to play some sort of a constructive role, I think. They don't have real interest in having Al-Qaeda, for sure, go back into Afghanistan as a safe haven and start plotting. I mean, the new Al-Qaeda, and that's a bad term because Al-Qaeda really never disappeared. But my guess will be is they have no problem attacking China just as much as they have attacking the United States or any of our NATO allies.
Or as they did the Soviet Union.
And clearly, I'm sorry,
right,
And so Russia clearly also
right,
has a deep concern.
So the Taliban doesn't necessarily have a logical ally anywhere in the world. Is that true? That they're pretty much their own strength is what they have.
The Taliban in the last time they were holding power in Afghanistan actually had about 3, and including Saudi Arabia. So I think Saudi's made a bad choice. They clearly aren't going to go that way this time. I don't really think they talk a good game. They always have had a great propaganda arm, and they're saying that they're interested in international legitimacy. But if you look at the actions on the ground, and I'm a big believer in actions make a big difference. Through their assassination program, through the use of military force to take over all this terrain and all these cities, I don't think that international recognition is nearly as big to them as what they're saying. I could easily see them go without any friends for a period of time because I think there's a certain fear of what could happen in Afghanistan may happen on the frontier of Pakistan. Pakistan has its own Taliban. It's called the TTIP, Tehrik al-Taliban in Pakistan. Sorry for the acronym there.
Is that the country where the most logical relationship might be because of the Taliban that exists in Pakistan?
I think that they have, attacked a whole bunch of the. That's not very articulate. They have attacked many Pakistani Army and Frontier Corps soldiers over the last decade and a half, and it's been fairly dramatic. The number of, it's in the thousands how many they've killed. So the answer right off is yes. I think that this will bleed over into the western portions of Pakistan, which is still largely a frontier. And that's why it's patrolled by the Frontier Corps. It actually has different laws there than a large part of Pakistan. And I do think that there'll have to be a great deal of concern starting there. But also in Tajikistan, the former Soviet republics that are along the north, all those stands, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, but clearly Tajikistan, the Russians are very concerned. They've been holding military maneuvers right up on the border. And let's not forget the Afghan army, 1,000 of them fled over the border in Tajikistan about 3 weeks ago. So yes, there are some areas where this is going to bleed over.
What is the Taliban's economic engine? How do they keep the wheels of government going? Who are they selling what to who?
So they'll be taking over the poppy trade. They already have in many cases in the South. And, they had a couple years while they were there in power before where they actually stopped it, just literally stopped it. They did it through sheer violence. I don't sense they're going to do it this time. In fact, they've been taking advantage of it right now for the times that they've been, able to control or at least dominate some parts of these districts in the south where poppy is mainly grown, but also in the east. And that's a huge amount of money. Basically, opium trade is still very, very significant. Afghanistan is the #1 dealer in opium in the world. So that's going to be the key part. Then probably just trade across the border at the key locations where you could cross the border, the mountains into either Pakistan or in the stands in the north, and as well as Iran into the west.
Mm-hmm. We're talking to Major General Jeffrey Schlosser. The title of the book is Marathon War, Leadership in Combat in Afghanistan. General, you were supposed to leave us right now, but have you got an extra 15 minutes you can share with us tonight?
I can do another few minutes. How's that?
Okay, we'll do another few minutes, and because our guests in studio both have a question for you. As we each have one more question. Back shortly from Chicago.
Sounds good.
Bruce DuMont back, and we continue with Major General Jeffrey Schlosser. The title of the book is Marathon War, Leadership in Combat in Afghanistan. And our guests in studio have a question for the General, and we'll start with Patrick Hanley. Patrick?
General, when I think about what's happening in Afghanistan now, it's hard not to think about the conflict in Vietnam, in Iraq. And a commonality that I see is that when the United States invades and occupies a country, we often trigger a nationalist reaction. You and Bruce had a good conversation a couple weeks ago about the lack of a national character in Afghanistan, but to the extent that there is one, I think it's resistance to foreign occupation. Now, if that's true, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, how do we think about foreign interventions, humanitarian or otherwise, in the future?
Yeah, so great question, Patrick. And so, what I would just do is just to kind of narrow this down a little bit is that I still believe, what Afghanistan struggles with is a lack of nationalism. I mean, and I mean that in a positive sense. In other words, a sense that there is a government that actually is there to, provide security as well as help your economic well-being. But what they do have, and have had for thousands of years, is a cultural what I would say is attribute that wants to repel any invader. Now, and this is a country, I think we may have talked about it 2 weeks ago with Bruce, is that a country that was first invaded that I'm aware of by Alexander the Great in 323 BC. And the history over the last thousands of years are just traumatic. I mean, Genghis Khan, came through. In fact, part of the Hazaras believe that they owe their, bloodline back to Genghis Khan's troops. Tamerlane, Abdul Khan. I mean, and then finally, of course, the UK or the Brits, and then the Soviets, and then of course the United States and our NATO allies and others that came along. They have a cultural, I would say, affinity, not affinity, but I mean, I can't think of the right word. They don't want outsiders. And even if the outsiders are coming in and bringing good things, I mean, we brought schools, we brought medical care. I mean, this is the collective we. The last numbers I saw is that the Afghan life expectancy went up 10 years over the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely amazing. But culturally, they are not much of a nation still, I don't think. But culturally, they do not want anybody coming into that country.
Professor?
General, I was going to sort of relate it back to your interest in leadership. You talked about the Taliban maybe not really having any friends initially. What do you see what is the stability of the Taliban's leadership, or the ability to continue to lead in that environment, or what has your experience been?
Yeah, I think that the Taliban are going to have more challenges now. The society has educated, a good portion of itself over the last 20 years. Girls are now successful women at 20 years after 9/11, basically, and they've been to school, been to university. They are studying to be professors. They are media artists, or not artists, but journalists and radio announcers, et cetera, TV. Politicians, businesswomen. My guess is going to be that the Taliban will have a hard time trying to actually control them. But, violence has a very significant way of controlling people who don't agree with you. I mean, just remember that the Taliban took the international soccer stadium in Kabul and converted it during their last reign into a place of public executions. I think I just saw something about 2 weeks ago that said we're going to go back to Sharia law as far as burglary and stealing in the market and things like that. As soon as we can we're sure that we've got enough doctors who can treat amputations, because what they do is they amputate the hands for anybody that's caught in thievery. This is going to be hard for, I think, many Afghans to take. What I don't think, though, is a lot of those same Afghans are going to stay in that country. They're going to do everything they can, that's why I call it basically a human diaspora out of Afghanistan into other countries. And you're going to see that in Pakistan, but you're also going to see it through Iran into Turkey, as well as into Europe, and clearly United States and other NATO partners.
Mm-hmm. And again, I have one last question, and that is, you had referenced the importance of poppies to the economy in Afghanistan. In the early involvement of the Afghan war, there was a lot of discussion as to whether or not the United States should completely eradicate the poppy fields so that they would not be able to go back to drug trade. Were you involved in those discussions? Tell us a little bit more about what the ultimate resolution was, because to some, maybe you should have gotten rid of everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there was a huge effort by the United States. And I can't speak for other countries, other allies there, but and so remember that a lot of it was in the South as well. But on the east side, a little bit, just go back. While I was there, Bill Wood was the ambassador, William Wood. He had been the ambassador in Colombia. He had learned how to eradicate, certain types of plants and stuff like that through aerial spraying. It was always something that was debated in the United States as well as debated in Colombia. Should you be doing this? Is this going to hurtful to the people? Is it hurtful for the other crops? He basically came in wanting to do that and was talked out of it basically by others, including probably senior folks inside the administration at the time. Instead, what they tried to do was actually have basically a poppy eradication forces, and we actually awarded governors who got rid of poppy. I'll never forget doing that with several of them. But all that said is, after 40 years of warfare before from the Soviets and everything like that, most of the Afghans had no clue how to raise real food stuff anymore, any products like that, but they knew how to raise poppy. And so it was pretty hard to stop that. Plus the line of the draw from outside, people wanting opium, was really hard to stop. So it's still the number one producer.
So the resistance, just to kind of read through your comment here, the resistance did not come from the ambassador on the ground, Mr. Ambassador Wood. It came from higher up somewhere, and that would include President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and would it also have included the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld?
It could have been, as well as Secretary of State at the time, of course. Secretary Powell. Yeah. I don't know. I can't put my finger on where it was because I did not have discussions with the president or the secretary about that specific point. But a decision. Ambassador Wood and I talked about it, and he said, "Yeah, I sure wish we could have done this because." But he clearly was being told, "You are not going to do this in Afghanistan."
But a decision as important as that clearly was not happening at your level. It wasn't happening at the ambassador's level, and it was happening at the level of the 3 or 4 people that I just mentioned that basically said, for whatever the reason, it may have been a good reason, we're not going to eradicate the poppy fields. We do not want, we don't want to completely run them out of the business, and yet the customers of those poppy growers turn out to be Americans and people around the world who are addicted to drugs. So, you may not want to say this, but it was I think it was not a wise decision to make if indeed, at least elsewhere, we were talking about a war on drugs. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. But again, that's a political question. I wouldn't necessarily expect you to answer it. But I do want to say that the name of the book is Marathon War, Leadership in Combat in Afghanistan. Our guest tonight was the head of the 101st Airborne Division during that period of time in Afghanistan. The title of the book is Marathon War. The author is Major General Jeffrey Schlosser. He joins us tonight for the second time. You gave us a few more than just a couple of minutes, but General, always nice to have you with us, and thank you very much, and good luck with the book.
Thank you, Bruce, and also thanks for talking with me, Patrick and Nick. Very intellectually stimulating. So thanks a lot.
Very good. Thank you very
General.
much.
Thank you, General. It was an honor.
Yep.
Well,
okay. All right. Take care.
Thank you. Good night. However, we continue here. What's your reaction to my assessment of where the decision was made to not eradicate the poppy fields? Was that, in retrospect, am I being simplistic in that that could have been a good thing to do? Professor?
That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly this is an area that's outside of my realm of expertise. But as far as the decision-making capability, it sounds like it's pointing at folks in the top administration.
Excellent, yeah.
And the question you asked the question why? Was it for a pharmaceutical reason? Was it for potentially rebuilding Afghanistan later? Who knows? But we don't have those answers.
Right.
I do worry. I spent about 10 years in Washington, and I think it inoculated me to conspiracy theories because I realized there were so many things happening all at once, none of which were very successful. I do worry that this might have been a casualty of the forever war symptom, right? So many decisions were happening in the national security staff having to do with Iraq, having to do with China and Russia, that this might have been one of those things that just didn't get the attention that it deserved.
In retrospect, do you agree that it should have?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, certainly. I mean, from what I'm hearing, I mean, obviously, I'm learning as we go. But it was certainly fascinating to talk to the general.
There's always a reason why something that looks like it should be obvious doesn't happen if it doesn't happen. And I think it may take us 20 years or maybe 40 years to get a straight answer to that. But I think the general, he pinpointed at least some of the people that were involved in the decision chain of command there, and it went up to the President of the United States. I'm Bruce DuMont. 1-800-723-8029 is the number. Back shortly with one last segment. If the airport in Kabul is going nowhere, I mean, did somebody say... Bruce DuMont back in Chicago. We got one more segment. During the break, I was asking our friends in the studio here whether or not there would be an appetite anywhere in the political spectrum for doing some more in Afghanistan before we get to the end of the month, or the end is coming up very, very quickly. What's your take for that? I mean, and I posed the question. I mean, if we're in a situation, as the general suggested, that we might be, that the control of the Kabul airport may be just gone. I mean, would there be an effort to at least protect and keep the Kabul airport open?
The question to me is whether or not Kabul can be held by the Afghan government with or without the support of the international community, and the answer could be no. The conflict breaks my heart, frankly, and hearing the general speak about all the Afghans who assisted the United States and the Allies over the last 20 years is truly heartbreaking. But what I can't help but think about is whether the strategic situation in Afghanistan between 2000 and potentially 2022 is very different. And I think about whether leaders will consider this when they think about invading countries in future.
You asked about the political situation, and I certainly don't think there's a political appetite in this country, given where things are, to see anything more. However, the question becomes whether American or international involvement to hold that is of interest to Americans, or could be sold in a way that shows that support is important to the stability for American interests one way or another, which I don't think the administration has been interested in making that case right now, at least under the current leadership. And the question becomes, if it isn't held, what are the long-term consequences to American diplomacy beyond that? And those are questions we don't have the answer to.
And if the Taliban is aggressive in rooting out those interpreters that help the United States, as well as their families, as well as anybody else, whether it's a general, a police chief, a county clerk, whatever it is, that has been perceived as having been soft on the United States or supportive of the United States, if there's going to be an aggressive bloodbath in that country, are we ever going to be able to develop any kind of a structure that would indicate an intelligence structure that would let us know in advance whether or not there were more efforts being made to create other terrorist organizations or terrorist attacks on the United States, like what prompted this war?
Well, and if you'd allow me to add one more thing, and Patrick alluded to this a little bit, but how quickly it's gone the other way since the American forces have been pulling out,
yes,
just shows how unstable it is. And so the question becomes, how much resource is needed? It's obviously a much bigger depth of well than we anticipated, and what do you do in that situation?
I'd say there's not a lot of hope to look for in this situation, but one thing I do think about is what happens when if the Taliban were to take power. And the general mentioned something very interesting, that there's been 20 years of women, of moderates, of folks who have lived and to an extent prospered under a secular government. And whether they will experience and whether they will tolerate the Taliban in the same way over the next 10 years that perhaps Afghans were used to towards the latter half of the 20th century, there might be a ray of hope in that.
Or they could all be massacred.
Yeah.
Well, and that goes back to the humanitarian interest, and again, we talk about the slow wheels of government turning for those potential interpreters, but they don't have time, unfortunately, and their families are in a much worse situation.
But what do we do if indeed let's say, for the sake of the discussion, we get as many of those interpreters out, okay, and they're living somewhere in the United States, and they're living safely in the United States, and then all hell continues to break loose in Afghanistan, and we get this widespread bloodbath of going after women and the educated and the intelligentsia and everybody else, and literally it becomes a situation where there's a murderous reign going on. Do we just sit back? Does the world just sit back and say, you know what, by golly, we should have done more, but there's nothing we're going to do about this, and it just continues without any hope? Is that where you think we are at?
Bruce, it boils my blood, and I'm a liberal here and I'm a liberal abroad, and sadly my answer to you is that the international infrastructure to help in a constructive way, to go in and help a country's population through that and then give them the economic assistance they need to create a stable society, does not exist at this point. You look at what happened in Libya, a clear-cut case where a group was going to be massacred by a crazy dictator. The United States and others intervened. The dictator was taken down and killed, but Libya continues in a situation of political instability and civil war.
I would just say, it is unfortunate. I look at even in the situation, and I'm going to liken it to where I've traveled, but in Venezuela, where we've had, America probably could have done more, and the international community. So it is sad, and I don't know if the answer we're coming to is necessarily the right answer, but it's what's seems to be on the table right now.
Nick Kaczarubis, we thank you very much from DePaul University, and also Patrick Hanley, thank you very much. Consultant making his first appearance on the program. Nice job this evening from each of you. I want to thank Frank Rodriguez and Anthony Marshall, and also Keith Keith Conrad for their assistance. And also special thanks to Andrew Marshall, who is going back to school next week. So he's saying farewell to these microphones and WIND and helping us on Sunday night, and we wish him well. On a programming note, since we're talking about Afghanistan this evening, I discovered something in the Beyond the Beltway archives that we are going to show for you on September 12th. On September 12th, you know, America will have talked about what's been going on for the last 20 years, and we will have a rebroadcast of the show we did 20 years ago that night on the 12th of September. I'm Bruce DuMont. Good night.